The polished marble floor reflected the city lights so clearly it looked like the night itself had slipped inside the building. And right there in the middle of that reflection, beneath chandeliers that cost more than most homes, a small boy sat alone on a leather bench with his feet not quite touching the ground, waiting in a silence that didn't belong in a place built for power. And that was the exact moment Ethan Cole stopped walking. It wasn't hesitation, not really. It was something stranger, something instinctive, like his body had recognized something before his mind could catch up, because nothing about this scene made sense. Not the child, not the hour, not the way the boy's tiny hands were folded neatly in his lap, as if he'd been taught to take up as little space as possible. Ethan had built entire companies on reading rooms in seconds, on sensing shifts in energy before anyone else noticed. But this felt different, heavier, like the air had thickened around him. And when the boy slowly lifted his head and their eyes met, the world narrowed into something precise and unbearable. The child's eyes were dark, steady, and familiar in a way that didn't ask permission. The kind of familiarity that bypassed logic and landed somewhere deeper, and Ethan felt it hit him in the chest before he could explain it. Because those eyes weren't just similar, they were exact. The same quiet intensity he had seen in old photographs of himself. The same stillness that people used to call intimidating even when he was just a kid standing in oversized shoes. The boy blinked once, as if adjusting to the light, and for a brief second his expression shifted into something softer, almost curious, and Ethan's breath caught without warning, because it felt like looking at a version of himself that had never been shaped by boardrooms or headlines or expectations. The sound of soft footsteps broke the moment, measured and calm, and a woman stepped out from the hallway where the lights dimmed into shadows, her uniform simple, sleeves rolled just enough to show the strain of long hours, her hands still damp from cleaning solution that caught the light as she moved. And yet there was nothing small about the way she carried herself, nothing uncertain in the way her gaze landed on Ethan and assessed him in a single glance. Nia Brooks didn't rush, didn't apologize, didn't look surprised to see a billionaire standing a few feet from her child. She simply crossed the space with quiet certainty and placed a hand lightly on the boy's shoulder, a gesture that was both gentle and immovable, and in that single motion, she shifted the balance of the entire room. Ethan watched her, something tightening in his chest as recognition flickered at the edge of his memory. Not a clear image, not yet, just a feeling that refused to settle. And when the boy instinctively leaned slightly into her touch, Ethan noticed the detail that made his pulse stutter, the way the child tilted his head, the angle of it, precise and familiar, like muscle memory inherited without being taught. "We're done for tonight," Nia said, her voice low and steady, not directed at Ethan but not avoiding him either, and the boy nodded as if he understood more than most children his age should, gathering a small backpack from beside him, movements quiet and deliberate. Ethan should have walked away then, should have let the moment pass like every other detail in a long day of decisions and deals, but he didn't move, because something inside him refused to let go of what he had just seen, and before he could stop himself, his voice broke the silence, softer than he expected. "How old is he?" Question hung there, simple, almost harmless, but it carried weight he couldn't fully name. Nia's eyes flicked toward him, not defensive, not confrontational, just aware, and for a second she said nothing, as if deciding whether the answer mattered. 6, she replied finally, her tone even, controlled, and that number landed harder than it should have, echoing somewhere deep in Ethan's mind where timelines and forgotten moments began to shift. The boy looked up again, studying Ethan with the kind of openness that children rarely hide, and then, almost without thinking, he said, "Good night, sir." And the way he said it, the exact rhythm, the slight pause before the last word, sent something sharp through Ethan's chest, because it wasn't just polite, it was familiar in a way that felt lived in, like hearing your own voice come from somewhere else. Nia's hand tightened just slightly on the boy's shoulder, not enough to be noticed by anyone else, but Ethan saw it, felt the intention behind it, and she guided him gently toward the hallway without another word, her posture straight, her pace unhurried, leaving Ethan standing in a silence that now felt entirely different from the one he had walked into. Minutes later, the building seemed too quiet, the reflections on the marble too sharp, and Ethan found himself replaying the moment again and again, every detail sharpening instead of fading. The eyes, the voice, the age, each one fitting into a pattern he hadn't asked to see. And by the time he stepped into his office, the decision had already been made somewhere beneath his awareness. "I need everything on a cleaner named Nia Brooks," he said into his phone, his voice back to its usual control. But something underneath it had shifted, something that couldn't be undone. And as he stood by the window, overlooking a city that had always bent to his will, for the first time in years, Ethan Cole felt the unsettling weight of a question he couldn't dismiss. Because somewhere in that quiet hallway, in the reflection of a child's eyes, a truth had begun to take shape, and it was already changing everything. The city looked different from the 37th floor that night. Not quieter, not slower, but distant in a way Ethan Cole had never noticed before, as if the glass between him and everything else had thickened into something more than just a window. And for the first time in years, he was not thinking about numbers or negotiations or the next acquisition waiting on his calendar. He was thinking about a pair of eyes that had no right to feel that familiar. The file arrived faster than expected, because things always did when his name was attached. And yet when he opened it, he did not scroll immediately. He just stood there for a second, hand resting on the edge of his desk, as if some part of him understood that once he read what was inside, there would be no returning to whatever version of the night had existed before. Nia Brooks, age 32, employed through a third-party facility service company, night shift assignment for the past 18 months, no disciplinary records, no complaints, no requests for advancement, a life written in short lines that said nothing about who she actually was. And yet there was a quiet consistency in the way everything was listed, steady, controlled, deliberate, the kind of pattern that did not happen by accident. Ethan scrolled further, past employment history, past basic identifiers, until he reached the line that made his hand tighten slightly against the desk. Dependent listed as Jaden Brooks, male, age 6, and the number sat there in black and white, unchanged from the moment she had spoken it earlier, as if confirming something he had already begun to feel rather than revealing anything new. He leaned back slowly, the chair moving with a soft sound against the floor, and let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding, because the timeline was starting to align in ways he did not want to admit. 6 years ago was not just a number. It was a year he had deliberately pushed into the background, a year filled with expansion, travel, decisions made quickly and forgotten even faster. And somewhere inside that blur of movement, there had been a night, not dramatic, not memorable in the way stories usually were, just a moment that had happened and then disappeared without consequence, or at least that was what he had believed. His fingers hovered over the screen as if expecting more, something definitive, something that would either confirm or erase the question forming in his chest. But the file did not offer that kind of clarity. It stayed neutral, factual, almost indifferent, and somehow that made it heavier, because it left the conclusion to him. He stood up again, crossing the room without thinking, the reflection of his own movement following him faintly in the glass, and for a brief second he caught his own expression, controlled as always. But there was something else beneath it now, something unsettled, something that had not been there before tonight. He pressed a button on his desk, and his assistant's voice came through immediately, precise and ready. And for a moment Ethan almost spoke in his usual tone, the one that left no room for hesitation. But the words came out slower than expected. "I want everything cross-checked, medical records, timelines, anything that connects." There was a pause on the other end, not confusion, but recognition that this request was different, more personal than anything he usually asked for. "Yes, sir." The reply came, steady, and the line went quiet again. Ethan remained standing there long after the call ended, the silence in the office stretching out in a way that felt unfamiliar, because it was no longer empty. It was filled with possibility, and that possibility carried weight he could not ignore. Across the city, in a small apartment that did not reflect the skyline but the glow of streetlights and passing cars, Nia Brooks sat at the edge of a narrow bed, watching Jaden as he slept, his breathing soft, steady, the kind of rhythm that made everything else feel distant for a moment. And her hand rested lightly on his shoulder, not to wake him, not to move him, just to remind herself he was there, safe, real, untouched by the tension that had followed them home. She had felt it the moment Ethan's eyes lingered too long, the moment his voice carried a question he had not yet asked, and she had known this day would come eventually. Not because she had expected him to search, but because the truth had a way of surfacing in the smallest details, in a glance, in a gesture, in something as simple as the way a child said a single word. She leaned back slightly, her gaze never leaving Jaden, and her expression did not change, but there was a quiet shift in her breathing, a calculation happening beneath the surface, not fear, not panic, just preparation. Because she had built her life on being ready for what came next without needing anyone else to steady it for her. Back in the tower, Ethan returned to his desk and sat down slowly, the file still open in front of him, but he was no longer reading it. He was seeing something else entirely, a memory pulling itself forward whether he wanted it to or not. A hotel hallway, late, quiet, the kind of place where conversations were brief and intentions were not discussed, and a woman standing in that space with the same steady presence he had seen tonight, the same refusal to shrink. And for a second the memory sharpened enough that he could almost hear her voice again, calm, direct, unafraid of him in a way that had caught his attention even then. He closed his eyes briefly, not to escape the memory, but to hold it in place long enough to understand it. And when he opened them again, the office felt smaller than it had before, the walls closer, the silence heavier. Because this was no longer a question of coincidence. It was a pattern forming, one that connected a moment he had dismissed to a reality he could not ignore. The city outside continued as it always did, lights moving, traffic flowing, people living lives that did not intersect with his in any meaningful way, but somewhere within that movement was a child who carried something of his without ever having been acknowledged, and that thought did not settle. It pressed, insistent, impossible to file away like everything else he had chosen not to revisit. Ethan leaned forward, elbows resting on the desk, his hands clasped together in a way that felt unfamiliar. Because he was not preparing for a deal, he was trying to understand a truth that had already begun to take shape. And for the first time in a long time, the outcome was not something he could control, with a decision or a signature. It was something that had existed long before he recognized it. Something that had grown quietly, steadily, without him, and the realization did not come as a sudden shock. It came slowly, like a weight settling into place, undeniable and precise. And as he sat there in the quiet of his office, Ethan Cole understood one thing with a clarity that left no room for doubt. Whatever answer he was about to uncover, it was not going to ask for his permission to change him. Morning did not arrive with clarity. It arrived with weight. The kind that settles into a room before the light fully breaks through the glass. And when Ethan Cole stepped back into the building the next day, everything looked exactly the same, and yet nothing felt untouched. The marble still polished, the air still controlled, the quiet still expensive. But beneath it all there was a tension he could not unsee, because once something shifts in perception, it does not return to its original form. He moved through the lobby without slowing. But his eyes were no longer scanning for people who mattered in the way they used to. They were searching for a detail he could not explain to anyone else. And when the elevator doors closed behind him, the reflection staring back was not the man who had walked in yesterday. It was someone carrying a question that refused to stay contained. The hours passed in meetings that sounded distant even as he led them, voices blending into a rhythm he knew by heart, decisions made with precision that had built his entire world. But beneath every word, beneath every agreement, there was a second layer running quietly, replaying the angle of a child's gaze, the weight of a single word spoken with unintentional familiarity. And no matter how many numbers crossed the table, none of them carried the same gravity as that one moment. By the time evening settled again, Ethan had already made a decision he would not have recognized as hesitation before. He delayed his departure without announcing it, letting the building empty in its usual pattern, executives first, then assistants, then the quiet maintenance of a structure returning to its nighttime rhythm. And when the last wave of controlled activity faded into silence, he stepped out of his office and moved toward the corridor where he had seen them the night before. The lights were softer here, not dim enough to hide anything, but enough to make everything feel slightly removed from the sharp edges of the daytime world. And for a moment there was nothing, just the distant hum of ventilation and the faint echo of his own steps, until he saw him again, sitting in the same place. The same posture, as if time had looped itself back to the exact point where everything had shifted. Jaden looked up almost immediately this time, recognition flickering across his face in a way that was neither surprised nor overly familiar, just aware, and Ethan stopped a few feet away, not because he was unsure, but because the distance felt necessary, as if stepping any closer without understanding what he was stepping into would break something he could not repair. "You are here again," the boy said, his voice calm, observant, and Ethan felt the words settle differently than they should have, because they were not a question, they were a statement, and there was something about that certainty that mirrored a version of himself he had not thought about in years. "I work here," Ethan replied, the words simple, stripped of the authority they usually carried, and Jaden nodded as if that made sense, as if the explanation was enough, then glanced down at a small book resting in his lap, fingers tracing the edge of the page in a quiet, focused motion. Ethan noticed it without trying, the way the boy held it, not casually, but with attention, the same way he had once approached anything he wanted to understand completely, and before he could stop himself, he asked, "What are you reading?" The question came out softer than expected, almost careful, and Jaden lifted the book slightly, showing the cover without standing. "Space," he said, a single word, but the way he said it carried interest, curiosity, something that felt alive rather than rehearsed. Ethan crouched slightly, not enough to close the distance entirely, but enough to see the pages, diagrams of planets, lines of information that explained distance and scale in ways that were both simple and infinite. And for a moment, the building around them disappeared into something quieter, something more personal, because this was not a negotiation, this was not control, this was just a child explaining something he found interesting without expecting anything in return. "Do you like it?" Ethan asked, and Jaden looked up again, this time with a faint shift in his expression, something closer to a smile, but not quite fully formed. "It is big," he said. "Everything is far away but still connected." And the words landed with a weight Ethan could not ignore, because they felt less like a description of space and more like something else entirely, something that reached beyond the page and into the moment they were standing in. Footsteps approached from the hallway again, steady, measured, and Ethan did not need to turn to know who it was, because the air changed in a way that was becoming familiar, and Nia stepped into the light with the same composed presence, her gaze moving first to her son, then to Ethan, taking in the distance between them, the lack of intrusion, the quiet conversation that had unfolded, without crossing any boundaries she had not allowed. "Jaden," she said gently, and the boy closed the book without protest, standing and moving to her side with the same instinctive trust as before, and for a second, the three of them existed in a space that felt suspended, not tense, not resolved, just waiting. Ethan straightened slowly, his posture returning, but not fully, because something in the way he held himself had shifted, less rigid, less certain of its place, and when he spoke, his voice did not carry the same weight it had the day before. It carried something else, something closer to acknowledgement. "I asked him what he was reading," he said, not as a justification, not as a defense, just as a statement of fact. Nia held his gaze for a moment, her expression unreadable but not closed, and then she nodded slightly, as if accepting the boundary that had not been crossed. "He likes to understand how things work," she replied, and there was something in the way she said it that suggested more than just a child's curiosity, something about building knowledge without being given anything freely. Ethan glanced at Jaden again, the connection pressing harder now, not because of a single feature, but because of the accumulation of details that refused to separate themselves from him. And the question that had formed the night before did not disappear, it sharpened, becoming something that demanded to be faced rather than quietly considered. "We need to talk," he said. Finally, the words directed at Nia, but the tone different than anything he had used before, not commanding, not assuming, just steady, and Nia did not react immediately, did not show resistance or agreement. She simply looked at him with the same calm that had defined every interaction so far, and for a moment the silence between them stretched, not empty, but filled with everything that had not yet been said. Jaden shifted slightly beside her, looking between them without understanding the weight of the moment, and Nia placed a hand on his shoulder again, grounding him, grounding herself, and when she spoke, her voice was even, controlled, but final in a way that left no room for misunderstanding. Not here, she said. And then, after a brief pause, and not on your terms. And the words did not raise in volume, did not carry anger, but they landed with a clarity that Ethan could not push against, because for the first time in this situation, he understood that whatever this was, whatever truth was forming in front of him, it was not something he could direct. It was something he would have to step into carefully, or not at all. And as Nia turned to leave with Jaden beside her, Ethan remained where he was, watching them disappear into the hallway, the quiet of the building settling back into place around him, but nothing inside him returning to what it had been before, because now the distance between knowing and not knowing had narrowed, and the next step was no longer a matter of curiosity, it was a matter of consequence. The hallway felt longer after they left, not because it had changed, but because the silence they carried with them did not disappear. It stayed behind like something unfinished, and Ethan Cole stood there for a moment longer than necessary, watching the empty space where they had been, his mind no longer trying to organize the situation into something manageable, because it had already moved beyond logic into something that required a different kind of understanding. He did not follow immediately, not because he could not, but because for the first time he recognized that movement alone would not give him what he wanted, and that realization slowed him in a way nothing else had, forcing him to consider something he rarely allowed himself to feel: restraint. The next morning did not bring clarity, it brought precision, the kind that comes when a decision has already been made somewhere deeper than conscious thought. And by the time Ethan stepped out of his car, he was not questioning whether he would see her again. He was calculating how to approach a situation that did not respond to authority in the way he was used to. He adjusted his schedule without announcing it, shifting meetings, delaying calls, creating space in a day that was usually mapped down to the minute. And as the building moved through its usual rhythm, he waited, not passively, but with intention, observing the patterns of movement he had never paid attention to before, the timing of maintenance crews, the quiet intervals between shifts, the subtle ways the building transitioned from day to night without anyone noticing. When evening settled again and the last wave of executives disappeared into the city, Ethan stepped into the same corridor with a steadiness that felt different from the night before, less reactive, more deliberate. In this time, when he saw Nia before she saw him, he did not approach immediately. He watched for a second, not intruding, just understanding. She was working, movements efficient, controlled, her focus complete even in a space designed to distract. And Jaden sat nearby with his book open again, absorbed in something that required no permission from the world around him. And for a brief moment, Ethan saw something he had not expected, not struggle, not hardship, but structure, a quiet order that existed without his influence. He stepped forward then, the sound of his shoes against the floor announcing his presence before his voice did. And Nia looked up, not startled, not defensive, just aware, her gaze settling on him with the same calm that had defined every interaction so far. "You said not here," Ethan began, his tone measured, stripped of anything that could be mistaken for command. "So tell me where." And the words hung in the air, direct but not forceful, an offer rather than a demand. Nia studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable in a way that was not closed off, just controlled. And then she glanced briefly at Jaden before looking back at Ethan, weighing something that did not need to be spoken aloud. "Tomorrow," she said finally, her voice even. 6 p.m., public place. She paused just long enough to make the next part clear. "You do not choose it." And there was no challenge in her tone, no attempt to assert dominance, just a boundary stated with clarity that did not invite negotiation. Ethan nodded once, accepting the terms without hesitation, not because he was used to conceding control, but because he understood that this was not a negotiation he could win by force. And as Nia returned to her work without another word, the arrangement settled into place between them, simple, precise, unavoidable. The next day moved differently, not slower, not faster, but with a focus that sharpened everything Ethan touched, decisions made quickly, conversations kept brief, his attention divided but not scattered, because beneath every action was the awareness of what was coming. A meeting that carried more weight than any contract he had signed in years. When the time came, he arrived early, not out of impatience, but because waiting had become part of the process, and the location Nia had chosen was not what he expected, not a place designed to impress or intimidate, but a quiet cafe on the edge of the city where the noise of traffic softened into something distant and manageable. He stepped inside, the atmosphere different from the spaces he usually occupied, warmer, less controlled, the kind of place where conversations were not measured by outcome but by presence, and for a moment, he stood there, taking in the shift before moving to a table near the window. Nia arrived exactly on time. Not early, not late, Jaden beside her, and the way she entered the space did not change, steady, composed, her attention moving first to her son, then to Ethan, acknowledging him without giving him more than what was necessary. They sat across from each other, the table between them small, unremarkable, and yet it felt like the most significant distance Ethan had ever had to bridge. Jaden settled beside Nia, opening his book again as if this were any other moment, and for a second, the simplicity of that action contrasted sharply with the weight of the conversation about to unfold. Ethan did not speak immediately, not because he did not have questions, but because he understood that rushing into them would break something before it had a chance to form. And when he finally did speak, his voice was steady, controlled, but carrying something new, something closer to acknowledgement than assumption. "I need the truth," he said, not demanding, not accusing, just stating what had already become unavoidable. Nia met his gaze without hesitation, her posture unchanged, her presence grounded in a way that did not shift under pressure. And for a moment, she said nothing, letting the silence stretch just enough to make the weight of his words settle fully between them. Then she reached into her bag, not hurried, not dramatic, and placed a single envelope on the table, sliding it toward him with a motion that was calm, deliberate, final. Ethan looked at it without touching it at first, the edges of the paper sharp against the surface, and something in the stillness of that moment told him that whatever was inside did not need explanation, it only needed to be seen. He reached forward slowly, his fingers closing around the envelope with a control that did not quite mask the tension beneath it. And as he opened it, the world outside the cafe seemed to fade into something distant, because this was no longer about suspicion or possibility. This was about confirmation. His eyes moved across the document, the words precise, clinical, unmistakable, and the connection that had been forming since the moment he first saw Jaden settled into something solid, something undeniable, and for a second, the room felt too quiet, too still, because the truth did not arrive with noise, it arrived with certainty. Ethan lowered the paper slightly, his gaze lifting to meet Nia's, and there was no question left in his expression now, no uncertainty, just the weight of realization pressing into place. "You knew," he said, not as an accusation, not as a challenge, but as a recognition of something that had existed long before he had stepped into it. And Nia's response came without hesitation, her voice steady, grounded, unshaken. "I always knew." And the simplicity of those words carried more weight than anything else she could have said, because they did not seek validation, they did not ask for understanding, they simply stated a truth that had never depended on him to exist. Ethan leaned back slightly, the paper still in his hand, the reality of it settling deeper with each second, and for the first time in his life, he was not calculating the next move, not strategizing the outcome. He was sitting in a moment he could not control, facing a truth that had grown without him. And as he glanced toward Jaden, who remained quietly focused on his book, unaware of the shift that had just redefined everything, Ethan Cole understood that the question was no longer whether the truth would change his world, but whether he was ready to step into the world it had already built without him. The paper did not move in Ethan Cole's hand, but everything else did, not visibly, not in a way anyone in that quiet cafe would notice, but internally, something that had always been fixed, structured, controlled, had shifted into a space where certainty no longer belonged to him alone. And for a moment he did not speak, not because he did not have words, but because the ones he had always relied on did not apply here. The document remained simple in its language, clinical, precise, the kind of confirmation that left no room for interpretation, and yet it carried a weight far beyond anything printed on its surface, because it was not just evidence, it was a timeline, a reality that had existed independently of him for 6 years, unfolding quietly in places he had never looked. He lowered the envelope onto the table slowly, as if placing it down required the same level of care as holding it, and his gaze moved from the paper to Nia, then to Jaden, who sat beside her with the same calm focus, turning a page in his book as if nothing in the world had shifted, as if the universe had not just rearranged itself in a way that directly involved him. Ethan leaned back slightly, his posture no longer carrying the same certainty it once did, and when he spoke, his voice did not command the room, it met it. "Why did you not tell me?" The question came out steady, but there was something beneath it, not accusation, not anger, something closer to disbelief, because in his world, information was power, and power was never withheld without purpose. Nia did not respond immediately. She did not rush to fill the silence or soften the impact of the truth. She simply watched him for a moment, measuring not his words, but the space behind them. And when she finally spoke, her voice was even, controlled, and unmistakably grounded. "Because you did not ask." And the simplicity of that answer landed with a precision that cut through anything more complicated he could have expected. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly, not in resistance, but in recognition, because the statement was not wrong, it was exact, and in that exactness, it exposed something he had not considered, that absence was not always the result of being denied. Sometimes it was the result of never looking. He exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting again toward Jaden, taking in the small details that now carried meaning he could not ignore, the way the boy held his shoulders, the quiet way he observed the world before engaging with it, traits that were not taught, not mimicked, but inherited in ways that did not require acknowledgement to exist. "You decided for both of us," Ethan said, the words quieter now, not sharp, not confrontational, but carrying the weight of realization. And Nia's response came without hesitation, her eyes steady on his. "No," she said simply. "I decided for him." And then, after a brief pause, she added, "You were not there to decide anything." And the truth of that statement did not rise in volume, did not demand agreement. It simply settled into place, undeniable and complete. The café around them continued its quiet rhythm, the soft sound of cups being set down, the low murmur of distant conversations, life moving forward in ways that did not pause for moments like this. And yet at that table, time felt contained, focused entirely on a reality that had been ignored for too long. Ethan leaned forward slightly, his hands resting on the table, not clasped, not controlled, just present, and for the first time, his next words were not shaped by strategy. They were shaped by something less familiar, something closer to responsibility. "I want to be part of his life," he said, not loudly, not with force, just clearly, and the statement did not seek permission, but it did not assume it either. Nia's expression did not change, but there was a shift in the way she held her gaze, something deeper, something that acknowledged the weight of what he had just said without immediately accepting it. And when she responded, her voice carried the same calm certainty that had defined everything she had done so far. "You do not get to want that and have it happen," she said, her tone steady, not dismissive, not unkind, just real. Wanting is not the same as showing up, and the distinction settled into the space between them with a clarity that left no room for misunderstanding. Ethan absorbed the words without interrupting, without pushing back, because he understood that this was not a negotiation he could redirect. It was a reality he had to step into on terms that had already been set long before he arrived. "Then tell me how," he said after a moment. The question simple, stripped of anything that could be mistaken for control, and Nia held his gaze for a second longer before glancing briefly at Jaden, who had now looked up from his book, not fully understanding the conversation, but aware enough to sense that something important was unfolding. She reached over, adjusting the edge of his sleeve with a small, habitual movement, grounding him in a way that spoke louder than anything else in the moment. And then she looked back at Ethan, her voice steady, deliberate. "You start by understanding that he is not something you discovered," she said. "He is someone who has been living without you, growing without you, becoming himself without needing you. And each word landed with intention, not to push him away, but to place him where he actually stood in this situation. Ethan nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement, because the truth did not require his acceptance to exist, it only required him to recognize it. "And if I do that," he asked, his voice lower now, more measured, "if I respect that?" And he paused briefly, choosing his next words carefully. "Then what?" And Nia did not answer immediately. She let the question settle, not avoiding it, but allowing it to exist fully before responding. And when she did, her voice was calm, but there was something else beneath it, something that suggested both caution and possibility. "Then you show up," she said, consistently, quietly, without expecting anything in return. And she leaned back slightly, her posture still, composed, still grounded. "And maybe, over time, he decides what you are to him." And the way she said it made it clear that this was not a promise, it was not a guarantee, it was a process that could not be rushed or controlled. Ethan sat with that, the weight of it settling deeper than anything else that had been said so far, because it required something he had never had to give before: time without control, presence without outcome. And for the first time in his life, he understood that this was not something he could accelerate or negotiate. It was something he would have to earn. His gaze moved to Jaden again, the boy now watching him with quiet curiosity. And in that look, there was no recognition of what had just been revealed, no expectation, no resentment, just openness. And somehow that made it heavier, because it meant everything that came next would shape something real, something lasting. Ethan straightened slightly, not returning to who he had been before, but adjusting to who he would have to become. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a steadiness that felt different, less practiced, more intentional. "I will be there tomorrow," he said, not asking, not demanding, just stating what he had chosen. And Nia studied him for a moment, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in her gaze, something that acknowledged the decision without confirming it. "We will see," she replied, and the words were not dismissive, they were open in a way that left the outcome unwritten. The moment settled into silence again, not empty, not unresolved, but holding everything that had just been placed into motion. And as Ethan sat there, no longer holding the envelope, no longer questioning what he had seen, he understood that the truth had not just changed his world, it had rewritten the way he would have to exist in it from this moment forward. The next day did not begin with urgency, it began with intention, the kind that settles quietly into every decision before it is made. And when Ethan Cole stepped out of his car that morning, the city felt less like something he controlled and more like something he was moving through for the first time without a clear advantage. He had already adjusted his schedule again, not out of necessity, but because something more important had taken its place, something that could not be delegated or postponed. And for once, the weight of his day was not measured in numbers or outcomes, but in a single commitment he had made without knowing what it would require from him. The hours leading up to the evening passed differently than any he could remember. Meetings shortened, conversations kept direct, his attention divided in a way that did not weaken him but sharpened him, because beneath everything else, there was a quiet awareness that whatever came next would not respond to the rules he had built his life around. When the clock moved closer to the agreed time, Ethan left his office without announcement, without escort, without the usual structure that followed him everywhere, and stepped into the city alone, something he rarely did without purpose. But today, the purpose was clear enough that it did not need to be spoken. The location Nia had chosen the night before returned to him as he walked, not because it stood out, but because it did not. It was simple, unremarkable, a place that existed without needing attention. And when he arrived, he did not enter immediately. He paused for a moment outside, watching through the glass as people moved inside, conversations unfolding in quiet, ordinary ways. And for the first time in years, he was stepping into a space where he held no advantage, no influence, no control beyond his own presence. When he finally walked in, the atmosphere settled around him in a way that felt unfamiliar, not because it rejected him, but because it did not adjust to him either. And he moved to the same table they had sat at the night before, taking a seat without expectation, without assumption, simply waiting. Minutes passed without urgency, And when the door opened again, Nia entered with Jaden beside her, exactly on time, her presence unchanged, steady, composed, grounded in a way that did not shift regardless of the setting, and Ethan stood briefly as they approached, not out of habit, but out of something quieter, something closer to respect. They sat again, the same distance between them, the same quiet space holding more weight than the room itself. And for a moment, no one spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because what needed to be said required a different kind of timing. Jaden settled into his seat, placing his book on the table, glancing between them with the same calm curiosity, and then opening it as if this moment did not need to interrupt his own world. And Ethan watched him for a second, noticing the way he did not seek permission to exist in the space. He simply did, and that realization carried more meaning than he expected. "You said you would be here," Nia said finally, her voice even, not questioning, just acknowledging, and Ethan nodded once, his response just as simple. "I said I would." And there was no emphasis in his tone, no attempt to prove anything, just a statement of fact. Nia studied him briefly, not searching for weakness, not testing him, just observing, and then she shifted her attention slightly toward Jaden. "This is Ethan," she said, not adding anything more, not defining the relationship, not shaping the introduction into something it was not ready to be. And Jaden looked up from his book, meeting Ethan's gaze with the same steady curiosity. "Hi," he said, the word simple, unguarded, and Ethan felt it land in a way that caught him off guard, because there was no expectation behind it, no recognition of what he represented, just openness. "Hi," Ethan replied, the word unfamiliar in his voice when it carried no weight of authority, just presence. And for a moment, the conversation existed on a level that had nothing to do with the truth sitting beneath it. "What are you reading today?" Ethan asked, keeping his tone even, careful not to intrude, and Jaden turned the book slightly, showing him the page. "Planets again," he said. "I am trying to remember the order." And Ethan leaned slightly forward, not crossing the space completely, but enough to see, enough to engage without overwhelming. "Do you know them?" he asked, and Jaden nodded, a small, confident movement. "Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars," he began, listing them with a focus that was both practiced and natural, and Ethan listened, not interrupting, not correcting, just absorbing, because this was not a moment to direct, it was a moment to witness. Nia watched the exchange quietly, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in her posture, something that suggested she was not just observing Ethan, she was observing how he chose to exist in this space, whether he would push, whether he would take, or whether he would remain within the boundaries she had set. When Jaden finished, he looked up again, waiting, not for approval, but for acknowledgement, and Ethan nodded, a small gesture that carried more weight than any praise he could have given. "That is right," he said, and the words were simple, but they were enough. The conversation did not rush forward after that. It unfolded slowly, in small exchanges that did not force connection but allowed it to exist naturally. Questions about school, about what Jaden liked, about how he spent his time, each answer revealing pieces of a life that had been built without Ethan's presence. And with each detail, the reality settled deeper, not as something distant, but as something immediate, something he could no longer observe from the outside. Time moved differently in that space, not measured by urgency, but by presence. And when Jaden eventually returned his full attention to his book, the conversation shifted back to the space between Ethan and Nia, quieter now, more focused. "You showed up," Nia said, her voice steady, not surprised, just acknowledging the action, and Ethan nodded slightly. "I said I would," he repeated, but this time the words carried more than commitment. They carried the beginning of something else, something that had not yet taken shape. Nia held his gaze for a moment, and then she spoke again, her tone unchanged but her words carrying a deeper weight. "Showing up once is easy," she said. "It is what comes after that matters." And the statement did not challenge him. It defined the path ahead in a way that left no room for shortcuts. Ethan absorbed it without response, because he understood that this was not something that required an answer, it required action, consistency, time, and for the first time, he did not try to measure how long that would take. He simply accepted that it would. As the evening settled and the light outside the cafe softened, the three of them remained at that table, not as a resolution, not as a conclusion, but as the beginning of something that could not be rushed or defined too quickly. And as Ethan sat there, no longer holding on to control, no longer trying to shape the outcome before it existed, he understood that this was not about stepping into a role he had never played. It was about learning how to exist in a space that had been built without him and earning a place in it one moment at a time. The days that followed did not announce themselves as different. They unfolded quietly, one after another. But within them something had shifted in a way that could not be reversed, and Ethan Cole began to notice it not in dramatic changes, but in the small, consistent choices he started making without hesitation. He returned to the cafe the next evening, and the evening after that, not always at the exact same time, but always within the space that Nia had allowed, never earlier than expected, never forcing the moment to adjust to him. And each time he walked through that door, he did so without the weight of his usual presence, leaving behind the part of himself that controlled rooms and outcomes, stepping instead into a space where he was simply someone showing up. Jaden began to recognize the pattern before anyone said it out loud, the way children do when something repeats with enough consistency. And on the third evening, when Ethan entered, the boy looked up immediately, not surprised this time, but aware. And there was a small shift in his expression, something that resembled anticipation, though it remained quiet, contained, like everything else about him. "You came back," Jaden said. The words simple, but they carried something new, a recognition that this was not a one-time moment. And Ethan nodded, taking his usual seat, not too close, not too distant. "I said I would," he replied again. But this time the words felt less like a statement and more like a foundation, something being built through repetition rather than declaration. Nia observed the exchange without interruption, her gaze steady, measuring not just the presence, but the consistency behind it, and she did not comment, did not acknowledge the pattern aloud, but she did not interrupt it either, and that absence of resistance spoke louder than anything she could have said. The conversations remained simple, grounded in the everyday details of Jaden's world, school assignments, books, questions about how things worked, and Ethan listened more than he spoke, allowing the rhythm to form naturally, resisting the instinct to guide or shape it into something faster, because he understood now that speed would break what patience was slowly building. One evening, as Jaden flipped through his book again, he paused on a page, his brow furrowing slightly, and without looking up, he asked, "Why does Mars look red?" The question was directed at no one in particular, just spoken into the space, and Ethan felt it settle in a way that gave him a choice, to answer or to remain silent, to step forward or to stay back. And after a brief moment, he responded, his tone calm, careful. "Because of the iron in the soil," he said. "It reacts with the air and makes it look that way." And Jaden looked up, his eyes narrowing slightly as he processed the answer, not accepting it immediately, but considering it. And then he nodded slowly, returning to the page with a quiet sense of understanding. Nia watched that exchange closely, not with suspicion, but with awareness, because this was where patterns formed, not in grand gestures, but in small, consistent interactions that either respected boundaries or ignored them. And Ethan had not crossed the line. He had not taken the moment and made it his. He had answered, and then stepped back, allowing the space to remain balanced. The days continued, each one adding another layer to something that was still undefined but no longer uncertain, and Ethan began to adjust parts of his life without announcing it, moving meetings, declining invitations, creating time not as a luxury, but as a necessity, because showing up was no longer a concept, it was an action that required space. Nia noticed it. Of course she did, not because he told her, but because consistency reveals itself over time. And one evening, as Jaden stepped away briefly to get a drink, she spoke, her voice low. "Even, you are changing your schedule." It was not a question, just an observation, and Ethan met her gaze, not defensive, not dismissive. "I am making space," he replied, and the distinction mattered, because it suggested intention rather than sacrifice. Nia held his gaze for a moment longer, and then she nodded slightly, not approving, not rejecting, just acknowledging that he understood the difference. When Jaden returned, The conversation shifted back to him, naturally, without effort, and the evening continued as it had before, simple, steady, unforced. It was not until the end of the week that something changed, not in the environment, not in the routine, but in the way Jaden engaged. Because as Ethan stood to leave, the boy looked up and asked, "Are you coming tomorrow?" The question was quiet, but it carried something new, not just recognition, but expectation, and Ethan paused for a fraction of a second, not because he did not have an answer, but because he understood the weight of what that question meant. And then he nodded. "Yes," he said, his voice steady. "I will be here." And Jaden accepted the answer without hesitation, returning to his book as if the confirmation was enough. Nia watched the exchange, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes, something that acknowledged the transition that had just taken place, because expectation changes everything. It introduces the possibility of disappointment, and she knew that better than anyone. Later that night, as Ethan walked back through the city, the lights reflecting off the pavement in long, quiet lines, he realized that this was no longer about proving anything, not to Nia, not to Jaden, not even to himself. It was about continuing, about returning again and again without needing recognition for it, about building something that could exist without being defined too early. And for the first time in his life, the measure of success was not in what he achieved in a single moment, but in what he was willing to do consistently over time, without knowing exactly where it would lead, only knowing that it mattered. The question lingered longer than the moment it was spoken, not because it was complicated, but because it carried something fragile within it. And as Ethan Cole stepped into the café the following evening, he understood that this was no longer just about showing up. It was about what his presence meant now that it was expected. The door opened with the same quiet sound, the air inside unchanged, warm, steady, grounded in a rhythm that did not adjust for anyone. And yet when Jaden looked up and saw him, there was no hesitation this time, no pause to confirm whether the pattern would continue. There was simply recognition, immediate and certain. "You came," the boy said, and the words landed differently than before, not as an observation, but as a confirmation of something that had already been decided in his mind. Ethan nodded as he took his seat, the distance between them unchanged, intentional, and his response came without effort. "I said I would." But this time, the words felt less like reassurance and more like something he was choosing to live by. Nia sat across from him, her posture steady as always, but there was a subtle shift in the way she observed the interaction, not searching for inconsistency, but acknowledging the consistency that had begun to take shape, and she did not interrupt, did not guide the moment, allowing it to unfold without interference. Jaden turned his book slightly, as if already preparing to share something, and Ethan noticed the movement before the words came, a small detail that spoke of anticipation without demand, and when the boy spoke, his voice carried a quiet focus. "I learned the moons of Jupiter," he said, and Ethan leaned forward slightly, not crossing the boundary, but engaging enough to show he was present. "Do you remember them?" he asked, and Jaden nodded, beginning to list them one by one, his tone steady, his memory precise, and Ethan listened without interruption, not correcting, not adding, just receiving, because this was not about demonstrating knowledge. It was about recognizing effort. When Jaden finished, he looked up again, and this time, there was something different in his gaze, not just curiosity, but a subtle seeking, and Ethan responded with a nod that carried quiet affirmation. "That is impressive," he said, and the words were simple, but they held weight because they were given without exaggeration, without turning the moment into something larger than it needed to be. The conversation continued in that rhythm, small exchanges that built on each other without forcing direction, and for the first time, Ethan noticed something he had not allowed himself to consider before. That connection was not created through grand gestures. It was built through attention, through consistency, through being present in moments that did not demand anything in return. Nia watched it all without speaking, her silence not passive, but intentional, because she understood that what was forming between them could not be directed. It had to emerge on its own, and the only way to protect it was to allow it to grow without interference. As the evening moved forward, Jaden closed his book for a moment, looking at Ethan with a thoughtful expression, And then he asked a question that shifted the space in a way that could not be undone. "Why do you always come here?" he said, his voice calm, not suspicious, just genuinely curious. And the simplicity of the question carried a weight that settled into the air between them. Ethan did not answer immediately, not because he did not have a response, but because he understood that this was a moment that required honesty in a way he was not used to offering. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady, but quieter than before. "Because I want to know you," he said, and the words were direct, unfiltered, carrying no strategy, no attempt to shape the outcome, just truth. Jaden blinked once, processing the answer in a way that was both simple and complex at the same time, and then he nodded slightly, as if accepting it without needing further explanation, and returned to his book, the moment passing without resistance, without complication, but leaving something behind that could not be ignored. Nia's gaze shifted subtly, not in surprise, not in disapproval, but in acknowledgement of the honesty that had just been placed into the space. And for a moment, she said nothing, allowing the weight of it to settle fully before responding in her own way. "Knowing someone takes time," she said finally, her voice even, measured. "It is not something you decide, it is something you earn." And the words were not directed at Jaden, they were directed at Ethan, a reminder, not of a boundary, but of a process that could not be shortened. Ethan met her gaze, nodding once, not in agreement, but in understanding, because he had already begun to realize that this was not something he could approach the way he approached everything else in his life. It required something different, something slower, something that did not respond to pressure or expectation. The evening settled into a quieter rhythm after that, not because anything had ended, but because something had begun to take shape. Beneath the surface, something that did not need to be defined yet, something that existed in the space between what was known and what was still unfolding. When it was time to leave, Ethan stood as he always did, not out of habit, but out of respect for the moment, and Jaden looked up again, his expression thoughtful, as if considering something he had not yet said, and then, quietly, he asked, "Will you come again tomorrow?" And the question, though similar to the one before, carried more weight now, because it was no longer about pattern, it was about trust. Ethan did not hesitate this time, not because the answer was easy, but because he understood what it meant. "Yes," he said, his voice steady. "I will be here," and Jaden nodded, accepting the answer once more. But this time, there was a subtle shift in his posture, something that suggested the expectation had settled into something more stable, something that could grow if it was not broken. As Ethan walked back out into the city, the night air cooler, the lights stretching across the streets in long reflections, he realized that this was no longer about proving that he could show up. It was about proving that he would continue to show up, even when the moments were small, even when the progress was quiet, even when there was no immediate reward. And for the first time, he understood that the most important things in his life would not be built through control or speed, but through patience, through presence, through the willingness to remain, even when nothing demanded that he stay. The rhythm held, steady and quiet, the kind of rhythm that does not announce itself but settles into place through repetition. And when Ethan Cole stepped into the cafe again the following evening, something had shifted in a way that was no longer subtle. Because this time, Jaden did not wait for him to sit down. He closed his book halfway and looked up immediately, as if the moment of arrival mattered more than what came after it. "You are here early," the boy said, not as a complaint, not as a question, just an observation that carried awareness, and Ethan glanced briefly at the clock on the wall before returning his attention to him. "I had time," he replied, and the simplicity of that answer carried more weight than it would have days ago, because it was no longer just about being present. It was about choosing to be present even when it required adjustment. Nia noticed it as well, of course she did, her gaze moving between them without interruption, taking in the shift without acknowledging it aloud, because she understood that recognition, if spoken too early, could disrupt something that was still forming. Jaden slid his book slightly toward Ethan this time, not fully offering it, but not holding it close either, a small, subtle movement that spoke of openness without demand, and Ethan saw it for what it was, an invitation that required careful response, and he leaned forward just enough to see the page without taking it. respecting the space that still existed between them. "I found something new," Jaden said, pointing to a diagram, his fingers steady, precise, and Ethan followed the motion, listening as the boy explained what he had read, his voice carrying a quiet confidence that had grown over the past few days. Not louder, not more expressive, but more certain, more willing to share. Ethan did not interrupt, did not correct, did not reshape the explanation. He simply listened, asking a question only when it added to the moment rather than redirecting it. And that restraint did not go unnoticed, not by Nia, not even by Jaden, who responded without hesitation, as if the space had become safe enough to speak without needing to guard every word. The conversation unfolded in that same quiet pattern, each exchange building on the last, not forcing connection, but allowing it to deepen in its own time. And for the first time, Ethan felt something he had not expected, not control, not influence, but a sense of presence that did not require him to lead, only to remain. It was in that stillness that the shift became undeniable, because when Jaden finished explaining, he looked at Ethan, not just for acknowledgement, but for something else, something that carried weight beyond the moment. And then he asked, "Do you know a lot about space?" The question was simple, but it carried curiosity that extended beyond the book, beyond the information, into the person sitting across from him. Ethan considered the question for a brief second, not because he did not know the answer, but because he understood that how he answered mattered more than what he said, and he responded honestly. "Not as much as you," he said, and there was no attempt to diminish the boy's knowledge, no attempt to elevate his own, just a balance that allowed the moment to remain equal. Jaden nodded, accepting the answer without hesitation, and for a second, there was a faint shift in his expression, something that resembled satisfaction, as if the exchange had confirmed something he had been quietly observing. And then he returned to his book, the moment settling without needing to be extended. Nia leaned back slightly in her chair, her gaze resting on Ethan for a moment longer than before, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, measured, but carrying a new layer of acknowledgement. "He talks more when you are here," she said, not as praise, not as accusation, just a fact, and Ethan met her gaze without defensiveness, without attempting to claim it. "He feels comfortable," he replied, and the distinction mattered, because it did not center himself. It recognized the environment that had been created. Nia held his gaze for a moment, and then she nodded slightly, accepting the response without adding to it, because there was nothing more that needed to be said. The evening continued, but something had shifted beneath it, something that could not be undone, because comfort, once established, changes the dynamic in ways that are not immediately visible but deeply felt. And Ethan understood that this was where the real responsibility began, not in showing up, but in maintaining what had been built without disrupting it. As the time came for them to leave, the routine that had formed over the past few days played out again, chairs moving back, small adjustments, the quiet preparation to step back into the world outside, and Ethan stood as he always did, not out of habit, but out of recognition of the moment's end. Jaden looked up at him again, but this time, there was no question about whether he would return, no need to confirm what had already become part of the pattern. Instead, he asked something different, something that carried more weight than any of the questions before. "Can I show you something tomorrow?" The words were careful, not rushed, not demanding, but they carried a vulnerability that had not been present before, because this was not just about presence, it was about sharing. Ethan felt the shift immediately, the weight of the invitation settling into place, and he did not answer quickly, not because he was uncertain, but because he understood that this was not just a moment, it was a step, and when he responded, his voice was steady, but softer than before. "I would like that," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried commitment, not just to the moment, but to what it represented. Jaden nodded once, a small movement, but one that carried quiet certainty, and as he gathered his book and stood beside Nia, the space between them no longer felt as distant as it once had, not because the physical distance had changed, but because something within it had shifted, something that could not be measured but could be felt. Nia observed the exchange without interruption, her expression unchanged, but there was a subtle shift in her eyes, something that acknowledged the progression without confirming it, because she understood that moments like this were fragile, not because they were weak, but because they were new, and new things require time to become stable. As they walked toward the door, Ethan remained where he was for a second longer, watching them move through the space with the same quiet steadiness they had always carried. But now, there was something different in the way he saw it, not as something separate from him, but as something he was beginning to be allowed into, slowly, carefully, without guarantee. And as he stepped back out into the night, the air cool against his skin, the city moving around him in its usual rhythm, he realized that this was no longer about discovering a truth. It was about becoming part of one. And that required something far more difficult than control. It required patience, consistency, and the willingness to continue, even when the outcome remained unwritten. The invitation did not feel small, even though it was spoken in a quiet voice and wrapped in a simple question. And as Ethan Cole stepped into the cafe the next evening, there was a subtle awareness in the way he moved, not cautious, not hesitant, but deliberate, because this time he was not just arriving to be present, he was arriving to receive something that had been offered, and that distinction mattered more than anything else. The door opened with the same quiet sound, the air inside, carrying the same warmth. But the moment he stepped in, Jaden looked up immediately, the recognition already there. And this time, he did not wait for Ethan to sit. He closed his book completely and placed it on the table as if preparing for something different, something that required his full attention. "I brought it," Jaden said, his voice calm, but carrying a hint of anticipation that had not been there before, and Ethan felt it immediately, the shift from shared moments to something more intentional. And he took his seat with the same measured distance, not closing the space, not claiming it, just entering it with care. "What did you bring?" Ethan asked, his tone steady, and Jaden reached into his small backpack, pulling out a folded piece of paper, worn at the edges, handled more than once, and he placed it on the table between them, not pushing it forward, not pulling it back, just letting it exist in the space. Ethan looked at it for a moment before reaching out, his hand moving slowly, as if understanding that whatever this was, it carried meaning beyond its size. And when he unfolded it, the lines revealed themselves gradually. A drawing, not perfect, not precise, but detailed in its own way. Planets arranged across the page, small labels written carefully beside them, each one placed with intention rather than accuracy. And at the center, a larger circle, darker, marked with a name that made his breath pause just slightly, "Home," written in uneven letters. Ethan did not speak immediately, not because he did not understand, but because he did, and that understanding required a moment to settle, because this was not just a drawing, it was a perspective, a way of seeing the world that had been shaped without him, and now, for the first time, it was being shared with him. "You made this," he said finally, his voice quieter than before, and Jaden nodded, watching him closely, not seeking approval, but waiting for recognition. And Ethan let his gaze move across the page again, taking in the details, the care, the thought behind each line. And when he looked up, his response was simple, but it carried weight. "It is good," he said, and the words were not exaggerated, not embellished. They were real, and that made them enough. Jaden's expression shifted slightly, not into a full smile, but into something lighter, something that suggested the moment had landed the way he hoped it would. And he reached forward, pointing to one of the planets, beginning to explain why he had placed it where he did, his voice steady, confident, and Ethan listened without interruption, not correcting the inaccuracies, not reshaping the explanation, just allowing the logic to exist as it was, because this was not about being right, it was about being understood. Nia watched the exchange from across the table, her posture unchanged, but her gaze more focused than before, because this was a different kind of moment, one that could not be undone once it happened. And she was not watching for mistakes, she was watching for intention, for whether Ethan would take the moment and make it about himself, or whether he would let it remain where it belonged, with Jaden. And he did. He stayed within the space, responding only when it added to the moment, not when it redirected it. And that restraint did not go unnoticed. When Jaden finished explaining, he leaned back slightly, his attention returning to Ethan, and for a brief second, there was silence, not empty, but full, carrying everything that had just been shared, and Ethan folded the paper carefully, not rushing, not treating it casually, and placed it back on the table. "Thank you for showing me," he said, and the words were simple, but they acknowledged something important, that the moment had been given, not taken. Jaden nodded once, accepting the response without hesitation, and reached for the drawing, placing it back into his backpack with the same care he had taken when bringing it out, as if the act of sharing had not diminished its value, but added to it. The conversation shifted after that, not abruptly, but naturally, returning to the rhythm that had been built over the past days. Small exchanges, quiet questions, moments that did not demand attention but held it anyway. And for the first time, Ethan noticed something else, something that had been there before but had not been clear until now. That Jaden was no longer just responding to his presence. He was including him in his world, in small ways, in ways that could easily be overlooked if not recognized for what they were. Nia leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady, and when she spoke, her voice carried a new layer of meaning, not in what she said, but in how she said it. "He does not share things easily," she said, her tone calm, not protective, but honest, and Ethan met her gaze, understanding the weight behind the statement. "I know," he replied, and the acknowledgement was not about the moment, it was about what the moment represented. Nia held his gaze for a second longer, and then she nodded slightly, not confirming anything, not offering approval, just recognizing that he understood the significance without needing it explained further. As the evening moved toward its close, the routine played out again, but this time, something felt different, not in the actions, but in the meaning behind them. Because this was no longer just about showing up, it was about being trusted with something small, something personal, something that could not be demanded or expected, only given. When Ethan stood to leave, Jaden looked up again, his expression thoughtful, and instead of asking whether he would return, he said something else, something that carried a different kind of weight. "I can show you more next time." And the words were not a question, they were an offer, and Ethan felt it settle into place with a clarity that left no room for doubt. "I would like that," he replied, his voice steady, and this time, the response carried more than agreement. It carried commitment to the space that had been opened. As he stepped back out into the night, the city moving around him in its usual rhythm, Ethan realized that this was no longer about entering a world he did not belong to. It was about being allowed into it, piece by piece, moment by moment, and that permission, once given, required something far greater than presence. It required care, patience, and the understanding that what had been shared could never be taken for granted. The pattern had become something more than routine. It had turned into a presence that existed beyond the café, beyond the table, beyond the quiet exchanges, that had once felt careful and measured. And when Ethan Cole stepped inside that evening, there was no longer a question of whether he belonged in that space, only how he would continue to honor the place he had been given within it. Jaden looked up as he always did now, but this time, there was no pause, no moment of confirmation, just a steady recognition that felt natural, as if Ethan's presence had become part of the environment rather than something that entered it. "I finished another page," Jaden said, his voice calm, already shifting the moment towards something he wanted to share, and Ethan took his seat with the same deliberate care, his attention fully present, not divided, not pulled in multiple directions as it had been in the beginning. "What did you learn?" Ethan asked, his tone even, and Jaden turned the book slightly, pointing to a diagram of orbits, explaining how the planets moved, his words steady, his understanding growing not just in knowledge, but in confidence. And Ethan listened without interruption, not correcting, not guiding, just allowing the explanation to unfold in its own way. Nia watched from across the table, her posture unchanged, but her gaze more settled than before, because what she was seeing now was not just consistency. It was stability, something that had held long enough to begin forming trust, and that was not something she acknowledged lightly. The conversation moved through familiar rhythms, but there was a difference. In the way Jaden engaged, he no longer waited for questions. He offered thoughts, small observations about what he was reading, about what he noticed during his day, details that did not seem important on their own, but together created a picture of a life that was slowly opening up. Ethan responded carefully, never overwhelming the moment, never taking more space than was given, and with each exchange, the balance between them remained intact, something that had been fragile at the start now, holding with a quiet strength. It was in the middle of one of these small moments that Jaden paused, his fingers resting on the edge of the page, and he looked at Ethan with a different kind of focus, something more direct than before. "Do you work here all the time?" he asked, and the question, though simple, carried a new layer, not just curiosity, but an attempt to understand the person beyond the presence. Ethan considered it for a moment, not because the answer was complicated, but because the way he answered mattered. "I work a lot," he said, "but I am making time to be here." And the honesty in that statement did not carry weight in its words, but in its intention. Jaden nodded slowly, processing it in his own way. And then he asked another question, one that shifted the moment slightly. "Do you have a lot of people you talk to?" And Ethan felt the question settle deeper, because it was not about numbers, it was about connection, and he answered without deflection. "Yes," he said, "but not like this." And the distinction was quiet, but clear. Jaden did not respond immediately, but something in his expression shifted, as if he understood the difference in a way that did not require explanation, and he returned to his book, the moment settling into something that did not need to be expanded further. Nia leaned back slightly, her gaze resting on Ethan, and when she spoke, her voice carried a calm recognition. "He asks questions when he is trying to understand someone," she said, not as a warning, not as a guide, just as a statement of fact, and Ethan nodded once, acknowledging it without trying to interpret it further. The evening continued, but there was a subtle shift beneath it, something that had not been present before, because now the connection was no longer one-sided. It was being explored from both directions, and that introduced a new level of responsibility, one that required not just presence, but honesty, consistency, and care. As the time came to leave, the familiar routine unfolded again, but this time, Jaden did not immediately return to his book or gather his things. He looked at Ethan with a quiet seriousness that had not been there before, and then he said something that carried more weight than any question he had asked so far. "My teacher says you can tell a lot about someone by if they keep coming back." And the words were simple, but they held meaning that extended beyond the moment, beyond the cafe, into something that would define what came next. Ethan felt the statement settle into place, not as pressure, but as clarity, and he nodded slowly, his voice steady when he responded. "Your teacher is right," he said, and there was no attempt to soften it, no attempt to turn it into something lighter, because the truth of it did not need adjustment. Jaden watched him for a second longer, as if measuring the response, and then he nodded once, accepting it, and began to gather his things, the moment closing without resistance. Nia stood beside him, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, and as they prepared to leave, she looked at Ethan, her expression calm, but carrying something that had not been there before, not approval, not acceptance, but recognition, because she had seen enough now to understand that what was happening was not temporary. It was not a passing moment. It was something that had the potential to continue if it was handled with the same care it had been given so far. "We will not be here tomorrow," she said, her voice even, and the words did not carry apology or explanation, just information, and Ethan nodded, not questioning it, not pushing for more, because he understood that this was part of the process. That consistency did not mean control, it meant showing up when allowed, and respecting the space when it was not. "I will see you when you come back," he said, his voice steady, and the statement was not a question, not an assumption, just a quiet acknowledgement of the pattern they had built. Nia held his gaze for a moment, and then she nodded once, accepting the response without adding to it. And as she turned to leave with Jaden beside her, the space they left behind felt different, not empty, but holding something that had been placed there through time, through presence, through the quiet act of returning again and again without needing to claim anything in return. And as Ethan stepped back out into the night, the city moving around him in its usual rhythm, he understood that this was no longer about proving that he would come back. It was about understanding what it meant when he could not, and whether the foundation they had built would hold in his absence, because that, more than anything, would reveal the truth of what had been created between them. The absence did not feel like a break. It felt like a test, not of presence, but of what had been built in its presence. And when the next evening came and Ethan Cole did not step into the cafe, the space remained exactly as it had been, unchanged, steady, holding its rhythm without adjusting for who was not there. For the first time since everything had begun, Ethan stood outside a different window, in a different part of the city, his reflection layered over a skyline that no longer felt as distant as it once had. And yet his attention was not on the view. It was on the absence, the space he had agreed not to fill, the boundary he had chosen to respect without question. The hours moved slowly that evening, not because time had changed, but because awareness had, and Ethan found himself noticing things he had not paid attention to before, the way silence settles differently when it is chosen rather than imposed, the way waiting feels when it is not tied to an outcome, and for the first time, he understood that showing up also meant knowing when not to. Across the city, in the same cafe that had quietly become a point of connection, Nia sat with Jaden at the usual table, the same book open in front of him, the same quiet rhythm holding the space. And yet there was a subtle difference in the way Jaden looked up when the door opened, a brief flicker of recognition that did not find what it expected, and then settled back into stillness without question, without disappointment, just a quiet adjustment that reflected something deeper than habit. Nia noticed it, not because it was obvious, but because she had learned to read the smallest shifts, the ones that spoke louder than words, and she did not address it, did not fill the space with explanation. She allowed it to exist as it was, because understanding does not always require words. "You are quiet," she said after a moment, her voice calm, and Jaden glanced up briefly, considering the statement. Before responding, "I am thinking," he said, and the answer was simple, but it carried a depth that suggested more than the moment itself. Nia nodded slightly, accepting the response without pressing further, and Jaden returned to his book, but his attention moved differently, not as absorbed as before, not as distant either, just aware in a new way. The evening passed without interruption, the routine holding, but something beneath it had shifted, not broken, not disrupted, just expanded, as if the space that had once been defined by presence was now being tested by absence. When the time came to leave, Jaden gathered his things as he always did, but as they stood near the door, he paused for a brief second, his gaze moving toward the empty seat that had become familiar, and then back to Nia. He said he would come back, he said, not as a question, not as doubt, just as a statement. And Nia met his gaze with the same calm steadiness she had always carried. "And he will," she replied, her voice even. And the certainty in it was not based on expectation, it was based on observation, on what had already been shown rather than what had been promised. Jaden nodded once, accepting the answer without hesitation, and as they stepped out into the night, the moment settled into something that did not need to be explained further. Back in his own space, Ethan remained still longer than he was used to, the quiet of the room pressing in not as discomfort, but as awareness, because this was the first time he had chosen not to act, not to step forward, not to fill a space that had become meaningful. And in that choice, he understood something he had not before, that presence was not measured by constant visibility, but by consistency over time, including the moments when absence was necessary. The next morning came with a clarity that had not been there the day before, not because anything had changed externally, but because something had settled internally, a recognition that what he was building could not depend on uninterrupted presence. It had to hold even when he was not there. When evening returned, Ethan stepped into the cafe again, the door opening with the same quiet sound, the space unchanged, and for a moment, everything felt exactly as it had before, until Jaden looked up, and this time, the recognition carried something different, not just familiarity, but confirmation, and without hesitation, he said, "You came back," and the words landed with a weight that was different from the first time, because now they carried the understanding of absence and return. Ethan nodded, taking his seat with the same care. "I said I would," he replied, but this time, the words carried more than consistency, they carried proof. Jaden watched him for a second longer, as if measuring the space between what had been said and what had been done, and then he nodded once, accepting it without needing further confirmation, and returned to his book. the moment settling into something stronger than before. Nia observed the exchange, her gaze steady, and there was a subtle shift in her expression, not visible to anyone who was not paying attention, but present in a way that acknowledged what had just been reinforced. Because consistency had now extended beyond uninterrupted presence. It had survived absence, and that changed everything. The conversation resumed, but it carried a different weight now, not heavier, but more grounded, because it had been tested in a way that did not require words, and for the first time, Ethan understood that what he was building was no longer fragile in the same way it had been at the beginning. It had begun to hold on its own, independent of any single moment. As the evening continued, Jaden spoke more freely than before, sharing small details, observations that had nothing to do with the previous pattern, but everything to do with the comfort that had been established, and Ethan listened with the same care, responding only when it added to the moment, allowing the rhythm to remain balanced. And as the time came to leave once again, the routine unfolded with the same quiet steadiness, but this time, there was no question, no confirmation, no need to measure what would happen next, because something had already been proven, something that could not be undone by a single absence or a single return, something that existed now in the space between them, steady, patient, and growing. The space between presence and belonging had narrowed so quietly that it almost went unnoticed, and when Ethan Cole stepped into the cafe again, there was no longer a shift in the air that marked him as someone entering from the outside. There was only a continuation, a movement from one moment into the next, as if the line that once separated him from this place had softened into something that no longer needed to be defined. Jaden looked up as he always did now, but there was no pause, no moment of recognition that needed to catch up. It was immediate, natural, and this time, instead of reaching for his book first, he spoke. "I told my teacher about you." And the words landed differently than anything he had said before. Not because they were louder or more dramatic, but because they carried something that extended beyond the space they shared. Ethan took his seat slowly, the weight of the statement settling in before he responded. "What did you say?" he asked, his tone steady. And Jaden considered it for a moment, not rushing, not simplifying it into something easy. "I said there is someone who comes back," he replied, and the phrasing was simple, but it held a meaning that reached deeper than titles or explanations, because it defined presence in the only way that mattered to him. Ethan felt something shift in his chest, not sharp, not overwhelming, but undeniable, and he nodded once. Not because he had an answer, but because he understood the significance of what had been said. Nia watched the exchange quietly, her gaze steady, and there was something in her expression that had not been there before, not approval, not relief, but recognition, because what had been forming between them had now moved beyond private moments. It had entered Jaden's world in a way that could not be undone. The conversation continued, but it carried a different weight now, not heavier, but more grounded, because the connection had been acknowledged outside of itself, and that changed the way it existed within this space. Jaden returned to his book for a moment, but his attention did not stay there as long as it used to. He looked up again sooner, as if the conversation mattered more than the pages, and then he asked something that shifted everything in a way that could not be ignored. "Are you going to stay?" And the question was not about the evening, not about the cafe. It was about something larger, something that had been building without being spoken. Ethan did not answer immediately, not because he did not understand, but because he did, and that understanding required more than a quick response. It required honesty in a way that could not be shaped or softened. He leaned back slightly, his gaze steady on Jaden, and when he spoke, his voice was calm, but there was something deeper beneath it, something that had not been there at the beginning. "I am not going anywhere," he said, and the words were simple, but they carried commitment, not to a place, not to a routine, but to a presence that would continue beyond what had already been built. Jaden watched him for a moment longer than usual, as if measuring the space between what was said and what had already been proven, and then he nodded once, accepting the answer without hesitation, because trust, once formed, does not require constant confirmation. It recognizes consistency when it sees it. Nia remained quiet for a moment, her gaze moving between them, and when she finally spoke, Her voice carried a calm steadiness that held more weight than any change in tone could have. "Words matter less than time," she said, and the statement was not directed at Jaden. It was directed at Ethan, a reminder that what had been built could not rely on promises, only on continuation. Ethan met her gaze and nodded once, not in agreement, but in understanding, because he no longer saw this as something that needed to be proven in a single moment. It was something that would reveal itself over time, through presence, through consistency, through the quiet act of returning again and again without expectation. The evening settled into a rhythm that felt different from the beginning, not cautious, not uncertain, but stable in a way that did not need to be defined. And for the first time, Ethan allowed himself to sit in that stability without trying to measure it, without trying to predict where it would lead, because he understood now that its value was not in its outcome, but in its existence. As the time came to leave, the familiar routine unfolded, but this time, Jaden did not immediately return to his book or gather his things. He looked at Ethan again, his expression thoughtful, and then he said something that carried a quiet finality. "I think I understand now." And the words were not explained, not expanded, but they did not need to be, because the understanding existed in the space between them. Ethan did not ask what he meant. He did not need to, because he felt it in the way the moment settled, in the way the space between them no longer felt like something that needed to be crossed, but something that had already been bridged. Nia stood beside Jaden, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder, and as she looked at Ethan, there was a shift in her gaze that carried something new, not permission, not approval, but acceptance of what had been built so far. And when she spoke, her voice was steady, but softer than before. "We will see you tomorrow," she said. And the words, though simple, carried something that had not been there at the beginning, not uncertainty, but expectation grounded in experience. Ethan nodded once, his response just as steady. "I will be here," he said. And this time, the words did not feel like a promise. They felt like a continuation of something that had already been proven. As they stepped out into the night, the city moving around them in its usual rhythm, Ethan remained where he was for a moment longer, the quiet of the café settling around him. And for the first time since everything had begun, he did not feel like he was stepping into something unfamiliar. He felt like he was part of something that had been built with care, with patience, with consistency. And as he finally turned to leave, the realization settled fully into place that the truth had not just changed his world. It had reshaped the way he chose to exist within it, not through control, not through speed, but through the quiet, steady act of being present where it mattered most.